In the late 1990s, Volkswagen made a decision that, on paper, looked completely irrational. While most automakers were trying to reduce costs, simplify production, and squeeze every possible dollar out of family cars, Volkswagen decided to do the exact opposite. The company wanted to build a sedan that felt far more expensive than it actually was. A car that would sit below Audi, BMW, and Mercedes on paper, but could make buyers question whether they really needed to spend extra money on those brands. The result would become one of the most respected European cars of its era, the Volkswagen Passat B5. But to understand why the B5 became such a legend, you first have to understand the man behind the project. His name was Ferdinand Piëch. Unlike many automotive executives, Piëch wasn't simply a businessman. He was an engineer obsessed with perfection. This was the same man who helped create the legendary Audi Quattro, transformed Audi into a serious premium brand, and constantly pushed engineers to go beyond what seemed reasonable. When he became one of the most powerful figures within Volkswagen Group, he wanted the company to stop being seen as a manufacturer of merely practical transportation. He wanted Volkswagen to earn respect. Real respect. And the Passat would become one of the most important weapons in that mission. The previous generations of Passat had been competent cars, but they weren't revolutionary. They were family sedans competing in a crowded market. Piëch wanted something different. Instead of building the new Passat on a traditional Volkswagen platform, engineers were instructed to use technology much closer to Audi. This was a radical move because Audi was already becoming known for refinement and engineering quality. By borrowing heavily from the Audi A4 platform, Volkswagen suddenly gained access to a much more sophisticated foundation than most people expected from a mainstream family sedan. One of the biggest differences was the engine layout. Most family cars of the era used transverse engines mounted sideways because it was cheaper and more space-efficient. The Passat B5 used a longitudinal layout, placing the engine lengthwise like many premium German cars. Most buyers never knew this. Many still don't. But that decision changed the entire character of the vehicle. It allowed for more advanced suspension design and gave the Passat a level of stability and refinement that immediately impressed journalists. When the car debuted in 1996, reviews were overwhelmingly positive. The design wasn't dramatic. Volkswagen didn't rely on flashy styling tricks or controversial shapes. Instead, the B5 looked elegant, clean, and timeless. It was the kind of car that looked expensive without trying too hard. Even today, decades later, a clean Passat B5 still carries itself with a certain dignity. But the real surprise came once people got inside. The cabin quality shocked everyone. Suddenly, buyers were looking at soft-touch materials, solid controls, precise panel gaps, and a level of craftsmanship rarely seen in the segment. Many journalists openly compared the interior to cars from much higher price categories. The doors closed with a heavy, reassuring sound. The dashboard felt solid. The seats were comfortable even on long journeys. Every switch seemed engineered to last forever. This wasn't accidental. During the late 1990s, Volkswagen was spending enormous amounts of money chasing quality. In some cases, the company was arguably over-engineering its products. Accountants probably hated it. Enthusiasts loved it. And nowhere was that philosophy more visible than in the Passat B5. The car felt substantial in a way that many competitors simply didn't. It wasn't about flashy technology or marketing gimmicks. It was about how everything felt when you touched it, drove it, and lived with it every day. Then came the engines, and this is where the Passat's legend truly began. Buyers could choose from a wide range of powertrains, but one engine would eventually become almost mythical: the 1.9 TDI diesel. To this day, the phrase 1.9 TDI is enough to make many enthusiasts smile. It wasn't the most powerful engine. It wasn't the smoothest engine. But it combined durability, fuel economy, and reliability in a way that made it almost impossible to ignore. Taxi drivers loved it. Families loved it. Commuters loved it. Mechanics learned to respect it. Stories began spreading about cars traveling hundreds of thousands of kilometers with surprisingly few major problems. In Eastern Europe especially, the combination of a Passat B5 and a 1.9 TDI became almost legendary. But the diesel wasn't alone. Volkswagen also offered the increasingly popular 1.8 turbo, an engine that became a favorite among enthusiasts thanks to its tuning potential. Then there were the larger V6 engines for buyers wanting smoother performance and greater refinement. Suddenly, the Passat wasn't simply serving one type of customer. It was attracting almost everyone. Families appreciated the space. Business professionals appreciated the quality. Enthusiasts appreciated the engineering. Long-distance drivers appreciated the efficiency. The B5 managed to occupy a unique position in the market. It felt more premium than most mainstream rivals while remaining significantly more affordable than luxury German sedans. Sales quickly reflected that success. Across Europe, the Passat became one of Volkswagen's most important models. Yet what made the B5 truly special wasn't what happened during its first few years. It was what happened afterward. Because as the years passed and newer generations arrived, the B5 refused to disappear. It kept running. It kept accumulating mileage. It kept proving that Volkswagen's obsession with quality had created something extraordinary. Long after many competitors had faded into obscurity, the Passat B5 remained on roads across Europe, becoming a familiar sight in cities, villages, highways, and parking lots everywhere. People began realizing they weren't simply looking at another successful family sedan. They were looking at one of the last Volkswagens developed during an era when engineers often had more influence than accountants. An era when companies sometimes spent too much money chasing perfection. And that reputation would only grow stronger as the story of the Passat B5 continued. The success of the Passat B5 created a problem Volkswagen had never really experienced before. The car was becoming so good that it was starting to blur the line between Volkswagen and Audi. Customers who might have stretched their budget for an Audi A4 were suddenly discovering that a well-equipped Passat offered much of the same engineering, similar build quality, and nearly the same feeling behind the wheel for significantly less money. From a customer's perspective, that was fantastic. From the perspective of Volkswagen Group, it was a much more complicated situation. Yet for buyers, none of that mattered. They simply knew they were getting an incredible car. And nowhere was that more obvious than on the highway. The Passat B5 was built during a period when German manufacturers were obsessed with high-speed stability. This wasn't a car designed only for city traffic. It was designed for long-distance travel across Europe. At 100, 120, or even 140 miles per hour on unrestricted sections of the Autobahn, the Passat felt planted, confident, and remarkably composed. The steering was predictable. The suspension absorbed imperfections without making the car feel disconnected. Wind noise was well controlled. Everything about the vehicle encouraged long journeys. Owners often described getting out after hundreds of kilometers feeling surprisingly relaxed. That ability to effortlessly cover huge distances became one of the Passat's defining characteristics. But Volkswagen wasn't finished. In 2000, the company introduced a major facelift known today as the B5.5. At first glance, the changes seemed relatively minor. New headlights, updated bumpers, revised taillights, a fresher interior. But underneath, Volkswagen continued refining the formula. Build quality improved further. Equipment levels increased. New engine options arrived. The car became even more mature. By this point, the Passat wasn't simply competing in the family sedan segment anymore. It had become the benchmark many competitors were chasing. And then Volkswagen started doing something very unusual. Instead of being satisfied with practical engines and sensible configurations, the company began experimenting. This was the era when Ferdinand Piech's engineering ambitions were reaching almost absurd levels. Volkswagen wasn't content with building normal cars. It wanted to prove what was possible. That's why the Passat eventually received engines that seemed completely unnecessary for a family sedan. There was the smooth V6. Then there was the legendary W8. Even today, the W8 Passat sounds almost unbelievable. A Volkswagen family sedan powered by a compact 8-cylinder engine arranged in a unique W configuration. Why? Because Volkswagen could. That's the answer. The W8 wasn't built because customers were demanding it. It was built because Piech wanted to push engineering boundaries. The car became a showcase for technology that would eventually lead toward even more ambitious projects like the Phaeton, the Bentley Continental GT, and ultimately the Bugatti Veyron. But while the W8 attracted headlines, the real heroes remained the everyday versions. The diesel models that crossed continents. The 1.8T cars that enthusiasts modified. The wagons carrying families on vacation. The company cars accumulating hundreds of thousands of kilometers. These were the vehicles building the Passat's reputation one owner at a time. Mechanics started noticing something too. Despite the complexity compared to older Volkswagens, many B5s were surviving enormous mileage. It wasn't uncommon to encounter examples with 300,000, 400,000, or even 500,000 kilometers. Some required careful maintenance. Some suffered from known issues. But the fact that so many remained on the road for so long only strengthened the model's reputation. The Passat became one of those rare cars people recommended without hesitation. Ask someone in the early 2000s what family sedan they would buy with their own money, and the Passat was almost always part of the conversation. Then something interesting happened. The car began taking on a life beyond Western Europe. Across Eastern Europe, the Passat B5 became more than transportation. It became a status symbol. A clean B5 with alloy wheels, a diesel engine, and a well-kept interior represented success. For many families, owning a Passat meant you had finally moved beyond basic transportation into something genuinely desirable. The car developed a reputation for being solid, dependable, and prestigious without appearing arrogant. It was the perfect balance. Expensive enough to be respected. Practical enough to be justified. Durable enough to survive years of ownership. By the mid-2000s, newer competitors were arriving. Technology was evolving. Consumer expectations were changing. Volkswagen was already preparing the next generation Passat. But the B5 had already accomplished something remarkable. It had transformed how people viewed the brand. Before the B5, Volkswagen was primarily associated with practical transportation. After the B5, many buyers began seeing Volkswagen as a genuine premium alternative. Not quite Audi. Not quite BMW. Not quite Mercedes. But something much closer to them than ever before. And that's why the story of the Passat B5 isn't really about a family sedan. It's about a company trying to reinvent itself through engineering. A company willing to spend more money than it probably should have. A company determined to prove that a Volkswagen could feel special. And in the eyes of millions of owners around the world, it succeeded. The question is, did Volkswagen accidentally create the best Passat it would ever build? And for many enthusiasts, the answer is yes. The final chapter of the B5 story would only make that reputation stronger. Today, the roads are filled with cars that are faster, safer, and more technologically advanced than the Passat B5 ever was. They have larger screens, more horsepower, and features Volkswagen engineers in the 1990s could hardly imagine. Yet somehow, decades later, the B5 still refuses to disappear. Maybe that's because people don't remember great cars only through numbers and specifications. They remember how those cars made them feel. They remember family vacations, long highway drives, cold winter mornings, and the sound of a diesel engine starting before sunrise. For millions of people across Europe and beyond, the Passat B5 wasn't just transportation. It was part of their lives. It carried families, built businesses, crossed countries, and survived years of daily use that would have sent many other cars to the scrapyard. And perhaps that's the greatest compliment any automobile can receive. Because Volkswagen never intended to build a legend. They simply wanted to build the best family sedan they could. Yet somewhere along the way, they created something more. They created a car that would outlive trends, outlive expectations, and earn the respect of an entire generation of drivers. A car that proved engineering still mattered. A car that proved quality could be felt long after the showroom lights were gone. And a car that, even today, remains one of the most beloved Volkswagens ever built. The Passat B5 wasn't the most exciting car in the world. It didn't need to be. Because while other cars chased attention, the Passat earned something far more valuable: trust. And sometimes, that's exactly what turns an ordinary family sedan into a legend.